nothing better than a beautiful summer day in summer is a beautiful summer day in spring. Thank you for being here to enjoy the morning of it with us. We're going to be finishing up in Titus chapter 1, not the whole chapter, but the elder section, and we left off with a potential shepherd being qualified, but we're in discussion of how he shepherded his own children. So we're going to finish that up this morning, and I want to go back just as a reminder to verse 5 in the section. So Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says to Titus, and he's on this island of Crete, beautiful place in the Mediterranean. He says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city, as I commanded you. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, we now know better as a one-woman man." And he's having, in verse 6, faithful children. And we covered that, faithful. What does that mean? Well, it can be one of two things. It can mean baptized believers. It's used in that sense in the New Testament. Mentioned last week, well, I'm not convinced that it's that way because of the context of Titus and how it's used. And throughout Titus, it's consistently used of those who are reliable, or an object even that is reliable or trustworthy. And I believe that's the case for the potential elders' children. Plus, when you use the cross-reference of 1 Timothy 3, verses 4 and 5, there's nothing mentioned that would lead one to conclude that those are baptized believers, but simply that they are children that are in submission under their father's rule. So what would make a lot of sense, going back to the parallel of Titus 1, is that they're reliable, they're trustworthy, and they're in submission to their father. And he's demonstrated, as 1 Timothy 3 says, that he can manage a household well. So, where we left off is in that spot. We're not going to rehash all of that, but we didn't get to this part of the kids, and then we're going to move on to all the rest of the areas of qualification for the potential elder. Having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Okay, so what are these two concepts, and what do they mean? We looked at the positive of it, having faithful, trustworthy, reliable children. So here's the negative side of things. They are not accused of these two things that are not good at all: dissipation and insubordination. So the dissipation is defined as not living an immoral life. Not living an immoral life. Not under his control. Not in his household. Now, I don't think there'd be any reason for this to be stated if we've already said whether to be baptized believers following the Lord. Obviously, they wouldn't be doing that thing. But these are people not to be living an immoral way, because this father, he has standards for his household. I think a lot of times one of the best things that we can do is look at an example of what it is that we're discussing. So if you will, keeping your spot in Titus 1, turn to 1 Samuel 2, and we're actually going to spend a chunk of our class period in the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel 2 and 3, to see this activity in action and what it is that we shouldn't be seeing in a potential elder's life as far as his household goes. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, the 12th verse. "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men." What a compliment. There's not very often the Bible just comes out and says it in just so many words. These guys they're scoundrels. They are worthless. "They did not know the Lord." We're going to find out about these guys that they're actually serving as priests of the Most High God. So do you think they don't have a clue as to who God is? They know who the Lord is, but what's meant by they don't know the Lord? There you go. They don't have an intimate relationship with him. There's no connection between them and God. Oh, they're very well aware of who God is. They're serving as his priests, but they're not serving him, and that's the issue. So what's the problem exactly with their lives? We continue down into verse 13. "The custom of the priest," and as we're introduced to them, these priests in particular, "the custom back then of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Okay, so what's the issue with this? It's sticking a fork in a pot and getting some meat out. You've done that before, haven't you? What's the problem here? Old Testament law. What's going on? Okay, I would agree. Selfishness, and on what grounds would you lay such an accusation? You remember what Old Testament law is about sacrifices that are given? Who gets what's first in that sacrifice? God gets what's first, okay? And the other side of it is, who gets what's best of that sacrifice? It's laying down a principle of offering, and of course, we carry on in the New Testament, and we see that as well. Those very principles, it's always been that way. It's from the inception of time. In sacrifice, God gets what's first. God gets what's best. Who's getting what's first here? The priests are taking for them. Who does that include again that we just found in verse 12? Eli, the high priest. Eli's own sons. Okay, keep that in mind. But we continue on. There's more to it. Verse 15, moreover, before the fat was burned, may not be just like fat or the chief, the best portion of it, some would say. The priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you as law demanded, but only raw. And if the man said to him, well, let them burn the fat first, because after all, that's God's law. That's the way it's supposed to happen. He would say, no, but you must give it now. And if you don't, I will take it anyway, and by force. We find in verse 17, thus the sin of the young men. And I think that's important, okay? Let's store that away for right now. How old are these guys? Doesn't seem like very. They're maybe men, but they're young at that. The sin of the young man was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. And this caused people to look at the offering of the Lord with contempt. I know this is a terrible thought, and we don't believe we would ever see that, and for good reason, for the good men who are serving over us. But can you imagine if on the Lord's Day we would give the offering, and before anything was done with it, the shepherds, and obviously this isn't going on, we don't expect it ever to take place, but the shepherds of this congregation just took about half the offering, just pocketed it before they even went and did anything else with it. And if we knew that was going on, how would we feel about that, number one? And number two, how would we look at the giving portion of the worship period? Would you anticipate that with a smile on your face? With happiness, as we're told to do, give to God? People got to where they hated the offering, not because they hated giving to God, but they knew what was happening. People were just stealing it, those who were in charge. And in part, there are young men who are involved in this process, and of course, God's very upset about that. Look down in verse 22. Now Eli was very old, even though, don't forget, his sons they're young, okay? But Eli is very old, and he keeps hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel. And there's more to it than just stealing God's money, quote unquote, through the sacrifices. He also heard how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. You might recall, it's been a long time back, but in the book of Exodus, and also Jephthah's daughter, is my personal belief. I don't think she was a human sacrifice to God, but there was a sacrifice of her virginity, and she would never marry. And I think it seems that she goes and she becomes one of the servant women at the tabernacle, and there were those, perhaps all of them were virgins. Well, at least they're supposed to be. But you have men like this who are sleeping with these women, and based on the wording that's given, it's very possible that this is not consensual activity, but this could be forced. Now, if you take a step back just on legal grounds today, if you have church leaders that are stealing money from a congregation, let's say over time it ends up being many thousands of dollars, there's legal repercussions that could take place there. And also, if you have religious leaders who are forcing young women to have relations, I mean, that's a legal matter, if nothing else. So Eli, the dad of these young men, and he's over them, don't forget, as high priest. They're priests serving underneath him. And also, it appears they're possibly still a part of his household. And he's hearing all these things that his sons are doing. And give him some credit, verse 23. He said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad." Now, don't necessarily turn back. Let's just keep in our mind's eye what the qualification in the New Testament of spiritual shepherds are. And that is that they're not to have children accused of dissipation. That means they're not living immoral lives. The other one we haven't really discussed yet. They're not accused of insubordination. And the two of these are a tandem with one another. What is insubordination? That can be a legal matter also. You can get charged with that, with a police officer. And how would that be the case if you were being insubordinate? Very good. Disrespectful to rank. Anything else? Okay, unlawful, I would agree, yeah. It's to be unruly, disobedient, and one of the definitions of this term is not to be made subject or not put in submission underneath one. So there's one issue of the children could be leading an immoral lifestyle, and naturally the question comes up as a parent, well, if they're under my roof and I'm in control of them, they're living immorally, what am I supposed to do about it? Good question. What's a parent supposed to do about that biblically? Well, Marcy, I would agree. They're made to be subject. They're answerable to the authority of that household. Okay, so I know we don't have time to, from the very get-go, but I think we understand pretty well. Ephesians chapter 6, there's a responsibility of children to parents. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor, that's not disrespect, by the way. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Okay, so ideally you have great kids and they always do what's right and you never have to talk to them about anything. But what if they don't do what their job of the household is? And as a parent, and in particular here we're talking a father who's the head of that household, well, what's a father supposed to do if the child underneath his roof is leading an immoral lifestyle, won't listen to dad, and won't listen to mom? What's a dad supposed to do? Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I would think so. And you still maintain control, right? If that's the case. That's true. So we stop short of verse 4 in Ephesians 6. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. Okay, it's a management. It's not an iron fist. And remember, back in 1 Timothy 3, it's managing the household and keeping the children submissive with all dignity. And again, I know it's terrible, but as I stated last week, I mean, you could handcuff children and you could lock them away downstairs and you could starve them and get them to do everything. But that's not to do it in a dignified manner, right? That's to rule with an iron fist as a dictator and not as a manager of the estate. But you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. It's not with an iron fist and simply as a dictator so that they grow to despise you. But instead, you bring them up, you said, in the training or nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now, there are two parts to this. The training side of it is you instill in them the knowledge that they need to do the right thing. But what's the admonition side of it? That's the correction. For if they don't, you help them see the light if they want to turn their heads away from the light. You find a way to enforce your word and what the rules of that household are. Again, not as a complete tyrant, most definitely not as an abuser of children, but as a punisher, if need be, and a corrector of children. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 9 says, "Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us." They gave us punishment when we didn't do what they said. And listen to the result of that. We paid them respect. It was earned. It was earned in the household. And if we thought, well, I'm going to do things my way, we found out very quickly, we were reminded who's in charge of that household, and we did not want to defy those orders again. Now, early on, that's hard as a kid, right? And I told you a story a couple of weeks ago how I thought more than once, whenever I was punished by my father, Dad doesn't love me anymore. I wouldn't say that to Dad, but I would say it when I was by myself, But the older I got, and even shortly after, and typically before we'd go to bed, Dad would come in and hug me and remind me how much he loves me. And that's a helpful thing for a child. But man, you talk about when you get older, and you guys have experienced this too. There is no person on planet Earth for whom I have more respect than my father. I could not be more grateful for the punishment now that he gave me back then. But it's something that you learn over time. We had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Hebrews 12:9 goes on to say, "Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live?" And I think what he's stating there is that our punishment from our earthly fathers instilled in us a very important lesson, that our heavenly Father also teaches us what we need to know. And we do wrong, he's absolutely ready to correct us, willing to punish us, but to set us on the right track. And initially we might think, God doesn't love me anymore. But over time we come to understand better just how much he loves us and how he wants the best things for us. And that's why he corrects us and punishes us, which is exactly the point of Hebrews chapter 12. Okay, so I've said that from Ephesians 6, what the role of an earthly father is, connecting it to a better understanding of the heavenly Father and his interaction with us. Hebrews 12, to go back to where we are in 1 Samuel 2, so that we can make it back to Titus 1, if that makes sense. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 2. And as we read in verse 12, the sons of Eli, they're worthless men, immoral. They did not know the Lord. They know who he is. They're serving as his priests. They have no relationship, no connection, though, with him. And it's because of the immorality of which they're guilty. We read in the following verses how they're stealing the Lord's offering. Verse 22, they're committing sexual immorality. And it may even be to the degree it sounds like of rape of special female servants of God in his house of worship. Does it get any worse with that than that? And Eli, he's hearing all this information, and give him credit, he tells his sons, guys, this isn't right, what you're doing. Okay, Ephesians 6, verse 4. He's performing part of his duty as a father and his privilege. You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. Which part of that two-headed portion here is Eli fulfilling? The training and the admonition of the Lord. He is part of it. What is it? Okay, yeah. I think he's helping verbally to train them. He's saying, guys, you shouldn't do the wrong thing here. All right? Now notice about midway in verse 25, 1 Samuel 2. But they would not listen to the voice of their father. Sometimes that happens with kids, doesn't it? Our dream is that we're going to have these little angels as children who always listen to mom and dad and always do what they're told. But the reality is, some of us have these little demons who don't always listen to mom and dad and who don't. Now, that's every child, right, at some point. It's natural. Children want to know, what are my boundaries? Where are you going to draw the line? Well, I know what you said, but how are you going to make me do what you said? And children want to know that. They want to know it at the earliest of ages. Remember, these are not ancient guys. We're told they are young men, and they're serving as priests underneath their father, the high priest. He's in charge of them. He's been given authority over his sons, and in two different ways. But they won't listen to dad, even though he gives them good advice. Look in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, verses 11 through 13. 3:11 through 13. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew. And here's what it is. He's guilty of wrong because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. He's 50% really good father, isn't he? He's 50% doing a good job in that he's training, he's telling, he's teaching his children who they ought to be. But where is he failing, according to Ephesians 6:4? And following through with what he's taught them in the correction and the punishment of his kids. He doesn't give them the correction that they need. And God says, yeah, these guys are guilty and they're going to be answerable to that, but so also are you as a father. Because I entrusted to you as a steward, and keep that thought, that word in mind. A steward is when you have something very kindly that's shared with you, and you're expected to do a good job in handling that. God was very kind, and he shared these boys, these kids, with Eli, and he expected him to teach them what was right, but he also expected him to correct them whenever they were wrong. And he does 50% of that. He tells them what's right, but he doesn't hold them accountable for it. And God says, as a result, you've been a poor steward, and you've sinned against me, and there are consequences that you and your kids are going to face because of that. Now, go back to chapter 2. Back to chapter 2, and I want to read in verse 29. God sends a prophet to rebuke his high priest, and he says, Why then do you scorn, speaking to Eli, not to his sons, why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded? As best we know, he's not stealing any of this. Eli, I don't think he's guilty of that sin, but it's like God's holding him accountable for something that he didn't do. How's that? Let's continue. He says, the issue is you honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel. You had a choice. You could either love me and my family first, or you could love yourself and your family first. And as important as family is, God says it's not more important than my family. You've put your own family and its desires above mine. Okay, now, as we go back to our text, I know that's a lot of Old Testament for being in the New Testament. But as we go back to our text in Titus chapter 1, and we read about the one who's being considered to be a shepherd of God's family over his sheep, does it make more sense when we read that he is to have faithful, that is reliable and trustworthy children? The context seems to be to their father in the home, not accused of dissipation or leading immoral lives. And someone might say, well, yeah, they're kids in my home, and I've taught them right, but they're making these decisions. What am I supposed to do about it? The other side of that is not accused of insubordination. That is, they're made to be subject to the head of that household. He sets the moral rules, and they answer to him. Now, why is it so important in the church that we would have someone who has demonstrated in his home with children that they had to live moral lives and they were held accountable if they didn't do that? Why is that so relevant to a consideration of the church and shepherd over sheep? Bingo, Brad. So when we saw, and someone might have said in the Old Testament with Eli, now they're in a leadership role. He is the high priest over Israel, and his sons are serving in a leadership role as priests as well. Someone might have said, well, we're not really concerned about their personal lives. You know, we just want leaders who are going to do a good job, and we think these guys will do it. Well, what was true of Eli and his sons' personal lives, guess what so happened to be the case then later for all of Israel? As went the leaders' families so went the people of God. Now, does that make sense when we go back to Titus chapter 1? As have gone the leaders' families, very likely are so also going to go the people of God. Why is it so important that he's proven himself as a faithful, devoted spouse? And we concluded from that, well, it makes sense. He's about to marry the church, the bride of Christ, in a very special way. And very likely, however he's treated his bride is how he's going to treat the bride of Christ. Now, how do you think we might be able to make application from how he's treated his own kids? Very likely, so also he's going to treat the kids or the children of God. Do you like the way things have gone in his marriage? Well, that's probably what you're going to see in his special marriage now to the church. You like the way things have gone with his kids? That's probably the way things are going to go with the kids of God. Is that something that you want as a membership or something that you don't? Yeah. That's right. Thanks for that, Brad. And if you spent much time with kids, you know that the kids are like kitty cats. I mean, it takes a little bit of effort to earn their respect. It's not easy. You know, I'd like to think if you can do it with kids, you can do it with anybody as an adult. So I think there's some truth to that, Brad. Thank you. Okay, any other comments on that or questions? I know we spent most of our time. We've spent now more than 2.5 of our 3 class periods just on the family side. It's not because I hope it doesn't come across that way. I believe that that's more important than anything else that's listed. It just seems that there are more questions that come up about that than anything else. And so that's why I've really tried to emphasize that. But anything else as we move on and finish these others up much more quickly than the previous. Okay, so let's get into then verse 7. 4, kind of moving on a little bit from the family idea, although I do think it intertwines backward. For a bishop must be blameless. That's exactly the same word that we've already discussed in verse 6, and it's emphasized here that is not sinless perfection, but it's one who is an addresser of sin, someone who takes care of sin when it comes up. And by the way, that would make a lot of sense going back to family also. As a steward of God. Now, you recall this concept? What's a steward? Okay, very good. That's true. A servant, and you might have that in your version also. It's one who's had goods entrusted to you, and you've handled those things well. Well, so far, what has he demonstrated of what we discussed? He's had wonderful blessings entrusted to him, and he's done a good job. He's handled those the right way. In terms of family, the blessing of spouse, did a good job, handled that the right way. The blessing of children, did a good job with that, handled things the right way. Not sinlessly perfect, but someone who's constantly trying to do the right thing when sin comes up, takes care of sin whenever it arises. Not self-willed, not arrogant, not self-motivated, not self-serving. When it comes to right or wrong, he's always doing not what self wants, but any ideas there? But what God wants him to do, not selfish. Self isn't his motivation. Okay, and if we're not talking about cut and dried matters of right and wrong, but what would be best for the group of God's people, what would he do? What he individually, personally wants, or what the congregation wants and is best for them? Not matters of right and wrong, matters of difference, matters of opinion. Not self-willed. I'd like for you to turn, we're going to do this with this one, and the others probably won't have time, but let's look at 3 John. Again, sometimes I think it helps to give an example of this. 3 John verses 9 and 10. The apostle says, I have written something to the church. The whole congregation needs to hear this. But Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first. It's believed this guy was an elder, probably, in this congregation, some type of leader, in the very least, a respected, for some reason, individual. And what's his real issue? Selfishness, self-willed. And whenever it comes to what might be best for a people or what Diotrephes wants, it's always what Diotrephes wants. And it could be, it sounds like, even if it comes to a matter of right and wrong, it's always what Diotrephes wants, and not what God wants. Diotrephes is self-willed. He likes to put himself first, and he does not acknowledge apostolic authority, which means he rejects Holy Spirit instruction. It's the way Diotrephes wants it to be. John says, so if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, good, sound gospel preachers, and works to tear them down because it doesn't fit Diotrephes' agenda. John says, I'll talk to him if I end up being able to come. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers. He thinks that the fellowship of God and his people is in his own hands. And he can start saying, well, you don't have the right to have fellowship with God's people. You don't have the right to have fellowship with God's people, with individuals, with congregations. Now, it's one thing if people are genuinely in the wrong. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. It's just that's not the way Diotrephes would do it. And it's all his way or the highway. Not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to. Those who stand up for what's right in his craziness, he puts them out of the church. Well, I'll withdraw fellowship from you then. It's all about Diotrephes Incorporated. So I hope that helps a little bit when we're looking at Titus 1 and we read that someone who's a leader of God's people is not to be self-willed. When it's a matter of right or wrong, it's not what the potential elder wants, it's what God wants. When it's a matter of indifference or opinion, and there's a best thing for the congregation, it's not, well, this is what I want, so that's what we're going to do. It's what the congregation wants and what the congregation needs. Puts God first, puts the people of God second, and himself in third place. Not self-willed. Not quick-tempered. How do you see that as a potential good quality and a spiritual leader of God's servants? Not quick-tempered. I've never served as an elder of the Lord's people, so I can't speak from that perspective. I had the blessing, though, of serving as a full-time minister for getting closer, not quite, but 20 years now. And something I've observed in nearing 20 years is you'll have lots of opportunities for fights in the church. If you really want that kind of thing and you're going after that, you'll have lots of opportunities to blow your fuse. And I've told you before, I'll be the first person to admit that's a weakness of mine, and I have to fight that. I have to be careful about that thing. Many opportunities for it. But what it takes to solve problems and not to grow problems, to keep problems from coming into existence, instead of putting them there, is a calm, cool, collected individual who can calmly sit and listen, who can have a conversation with people, even though there might be a differences of viewpoint on something, but can still calmly talk about God and his word with others, instead of blowing a fuse and taking a very small problem and turning into it a much bigger one. Not given to wine. That's just simply being a drunk, not an abuser of alcohol. We'll have something in our lesson that kind of corresponds with that. The clouding of judgment. Not violent, which obviously means not someone who wants to duke it out over something, but actually it can even be milder than what that is. So not to be violent, just in its more general sense, is not to be a contentious person. Again, you're not looking for fights, and you're not instigating fights, but you're looking to solve problems when they come up, and you're looking to curb problems before they really ever even arise. Not greedy for money. Why would that be really handy for an eldership, not to be greedy for money? Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I've said it, and I have for years. For some reason, we don't practice this in America, and okay, but the teaching is just as ministers of the gospel are to be compensated for the work of the church. 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18, elders are to be the same way. And I think a lot of it has to do with age and blessing in America, and a lot of times it's retirement, and elders don't need that. But as a congregation, I've said before, and I continue to say, even though it's very noble of our elders up to this point, as far as I know, none of them has ever accepted any compensation from the church. As a membership, we need to keep in mind, and we need to be cognizant of what the potential needs of our church leaders are. And if we ever have an elder who isn't in that very fortunate state of just having overflow It's our responsibility as a congregation to make sure they're taken care of, just like we do our ministers all across the nation and the world. Roy? Okay, there you go. You're exactly right. And especially those who labor in word and in doctrine. So especially those who aren't just looking out for, everyday needs, but in addition to that, do a lot of teaching and or preaching among the congregation. Thank you, Roy. Not greedy for money. Remember back in 1 Samuel 2, who was receiving the offerings of God as they came in? The priests had a connection to that. Who receives the offerings of God today as they come in? But our leaders today, the elders of a congregation. I think it might be important that you have guys in place that can be trusted with money, and that you don't have people like Eli's sons who, and I know it was sacrificed, so it's a little bit different, but are taking that and just pocketing it, so to speak, for themselves. As I mentioned about Heath when we were in 1 Timothy 3, I know I could say the same thing about each one of our elders. If for some reason, I don't know how, I do Heath because he's always in my wallet, but I don't know with our elders, but somehow if my wallet got in one of our elders' hands and I didn't see that wallet for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it was brought back to me, hey, whatever the story is behind it, I'd trust them, number one, and whatever they tell me. And number two, I would not check a single thing in my wallet. I know, I can tell you right now, it would all be there. There wouldn't be much to be found, but whatever was there, that $25 of emergency cash I carry around, it would all be there. And it's nice having people like that in place who are handling the Lord's money. You don't have any questions about that? Okay, memory verse, 8, and we'll spend the last few minutes on 8, and 9 will be pretty quick. Yes, sir. Titus 1:8. Oh, man. Yeah, you're right. And I wish I could. I thought really hard about even just one more time. It's like, no, we're kind of in a time. It's been 3 weeks. And yeah, that's so true, Roy. Oh, man, absolutely tremendous. And not the least of which is hospitable. Hospitality. Generous to guests is what that term means in the original language. John? Right. Yeah, super. Okay, so being hospitable or generous to guests. Now, a natural place where that can occur and often does is inside of one's home. What's so nice about spending time with people, and especially fellow Christians in their homes? What have you observed through the years in that? What benefits come, just and briefly, because we don't have a lot of time for it, what benefits come from spending time in each other's homes? There you go. A lot of times you eat food, but it's really not about how delicious the meal or how disgusting it is. No, it's really not about the food, even though we commonly share food. It's about the relationships that are fostered in so doing. And that is so pertinent to one who's being considered to serve as a shepherd of God's people. Not because of maybe food that's been enjoyed between them, but because of relationships that have been built. Now, does that always only have to happen in a person's home? No, that's a great place for it to take place. But I want to give an example. Last month, a couple of our care groups met together. We coalesced. It was a large group, and we did it under a roof, but nobody's roof here. We did it under a pavilion at Bennett Spring. And man, we had a great time. And you talk about the generosity that was shown to all of these guests that were invited, many of whom are church members, a number of whom are not. And I think that's so significant for the one being considered as an elder also, to build up the church that is already there with those relationships, someone who's proven himself to be hospitable with the blessings that God has shared with him, but also for growing the church from the outside, inviting even more in, building those relationships, teaching others and converting souls. Hospital. So much more I know that could be said. A lover of what is good. I think this is really important. We often look at an elder as one who should stand against wrong, and that's certainly true, we're going to find in verse 9, but also stand for and promote what is right. It's not simply someone who doesn't do all these bad things, but someone who wants to do all these good things, and not just for himself and family, but also for the whole congregation, and tries to promote as many good things within that congregation as he possibly can. Lest we might end up as a congregation, the one-talent man. You remember him? Lord, I was afraid. I didn't want to do anything bad, so I just dug a hole and put it there, and look, I didn't do a single bad thing with that money. His Lord said to him, you are a wicked and evil servant, not because of all the bad that you did, but because of all the good with it that you didn't do. We need elders who not just want to avoid bad, but also want to do as much good individually, family-wise, and as a congregation as possible. Sober-minded, serious. That doesn't mean that he's stoic and he can't crack a joke. But he also knows what the serious things of life are, and he knows, Ecclesiastes 3, as there's a time to laugh, there's also a time to be serious about serious things. Holy, avoids what's wrong, does what is good. Just, two sides, is righteous, but is also fair. Oh man, I think this might bend back to his family. Have you seen fairness displayed in the treatment of children in his own house? Does he require this of the girls, but then he gives the boys a pass? Is he really strict with those who are older, but the younger ones, well, they don't really live by any rules? If that's what you see in his home, how do you think he might do things in the family of God? Is he going to be strict with the girls, but give the guys a pass there also? Is he going to demand this out of the elders, but not really have any rules for the young kids, or for the young people, and any expectations out of them? Self-controlled. And I really think this is the key, the linchpin of everything that we've discussed. And I'm not so sure what it doesn't just build up to that point. And as we close, I want to look back at these that we've discussed just very quickly. In his home, he's in control, verse 6, and not his spouse. In his home, he's in control, and not his children. As it pertains to self, he is in control, and not pride. He is in control, and not anger. He is in control, and not substances. He is in control, and not violence. He is in control of his life, and not money. Does that make more sense as we go back? He's in control of his life, but because his life is filled with hospitality, loving what is good, sober-mindedness, just, he's holy, he's self-controlled, really, who's in control of his life? The Lord above is in control. Go ahead, Roy. Excellent. Now that you said that, I'll mention this too. The meaning of the original term of being self-controlled is curbing one's passions and desires. It really isn't the control of actions, it's the controlling of the inside, so that when you control the inside, the outside is controlled by the inside. Yeah, excellent, Roy. Okay, well, I know there's so much more that could be stated about this. I'm going to save verse 9 for next week, okay? We're going to memorize verse 12. Verse 12 of the remainder. Familiarize yourself with what's left in the chapter. 12 memory verse, and we'll go 9 through 16, if I'm not mistaken, for next week. But any other comments or questions as we close about our brief study on elders and in the blessing that we're considering in this congregation of adding to our leadership? Okay, that's what we'll cover then next week. Thank you, everyone.